I don't talk about music very often on this show. I used to. The first video I uploaded to this channel was about video game soundtracks and how great they can be. But over time I've come to realise that people prefer the sound of my voice over anything that a video game can offer someone because you people are insatiable monsters with an appetite for the British accent. The soundtracks play a huge role in accentuating key moments in video games and often act in a similar way to how they're used in films. Dramatic music means something crazy is happening, sad music means sad things, and shitty music means, Music has been a huge part of my life from an early age, so I've always been hesitant throwing heavy criticism at any type of music, but even I have my limits. The great thing about video games is that we've got a very large sample size to choose from, and naturally some of these games have less than decent soundtracks to them. Subjectively, you can find something to love about any soundtrack, and music especially falls into that category of being something that anyone can love if they try hard enough, but certain creative decisions in the past have had more than a few holes in them. And some of those holes hurt to listen to, so I don't feel too bad about hating it. I will probably get over it. Before I left school, I really wanted to make a living out of composing music for video games. This never really materialized, but it meant that I studied it a lot and got really in-depth on why certain video game music works better than others. So really, the negative side of this has been a very long time coming. It's my first video about music on this channel for nearly 7 years. Let's hope I'm not rusty. I'll get this out of the way nice and early. With a few very famous exceptions, the further you go back into the history of video games, the worse the music generally gets. Obviously, there's hugely iconic examples of historically important themes that helped to mold franchises like Mario and Zelda into the monolith they are today, but not every company put as much thought and effort into the sound of a video game as Nintendo did. Arguably, it wasn't important to give basic video games anything more than a simple loop of a couple of notes chirping away in the background because the game portion of a video game should be enough to keep a player entertained. This started to change as gaming took on more ambition and also critically when the technology started to improve. Why waste precious space on a simplistic soundtrack when you could maybe fit some more sprites into the game's code? You'd have to compress everything down to make it fit anyway, so what's the point? It definitely took developers a little while to work out the best way of making soundtracks for games with very limited space. It's not so much of an issue with home consoles, but for the early handhelds like the Game Boy, it took a while for them to wrap their heads around compressed chiptune, and there's a lot of very shoddy examples of developers not really knowing what to do with that. Did you know that there's a Mega Man 2 on the Game Boy? It doesn't sound like it. Obviously not to be confused with the actual Mega Man 2, because Capcom realised pretty early on that it'd be pretty much impossible to squeeze an NES game onto the original Game Boy. But hey, this original Mega Man certainly feels like you'd expect it to, and you've even got Mega Man looking like a little gremlin on the cover, so it certainly looks the part. However, the problems become obvious as soon as you take a listen to any one of the music tracks from this game and have to apply some emergency first aid to stop too much blood from spilling out of your ear. I honestly believe that Kenji Yamazaki had written some pretty sweet melodies into this soundtrack, but for whatever reason, the process of synthesizing the notes into the usual 8-bit style put everything an octave higher than it should have been, resulting in this uncomfortably squeaky background music that becomes very distracting very quickly. The scale of this error becomes more apparent when you hear fan-made remixes online that rebalance the audio tracks or simply make all the music in the game lower and less screechy. Supposedly Kenji Yamazaki would write the music down on a sheet of paper and then send it to the developers so they could program it into the game, so I'm not sure you can be blaming the composer on this one. We'll have plenty of time for that later, trust me. The absolute best thing about video game music is how unrelated it is to the quality of the game itself. Most of the very best music you can find in a game is typically associated with a game of at least equal quality, but music is conceived in a completely different way to every other aspect of your standard video game. Often it's worked on by someone who isn't involved with the day-to-day development of the game, and in order to give composers enough time to complete an entire soundtrack worth of music, they're given loose concepts around which to make the music, rather than anything that looks like a finished product. This kind of detachment has come in very handy with some of the more terrible Sonic games, since the soundtrack didn't get caught up in all the drama and rushed production, and is therefore actually kind of incredible. Sadly, this doesn't always apply, because Sonic Boom was an uninteresting collection of stock music, and the ill-fated Sonic Chronicles, a BioWare project before they were ruining Mass Effect and making Anthem, this had a few issues as well. Not as many as Anthem though, so at least they didn't peak too soon. Sonic Chronicles, subtitled The Dark Brotherhood, is a little different to the Sonic games you might be used to. If you ever wanted to see what a Sonic RPG would look like, firstly, why? But also, it's a bit weird and not very good. In the past, bad Sonic games ended up being slightly more tolerable because you got some tasty jams beeping away in the background that helps to mask some of the pain that you're experiencing right now. Sonic Chronicles, for a reason that has been speculated as having something to do with copyright snafus or a good old-fashioned running out of time, never seen that excuse in a Sonic game before, this game has a soundtrack full of low-quality MIDIs for some reason. It's not just the sound quality that's screwed up, because themes like Central City sound like a collection of notes put into a blender and squeezed out onto a computer. Like, there's a melody in here somewhere, but I just can't find it, man. It's really annoying. Whatever the reason is, Sonic Chronicles' soundtrack feels extremely rushed, and themes that aren't just remixes of older Sonic music are weird and angular and abstract and terrible. Much like Sonic Chronicles itself. At least the soundtrack suits the game. With the sheer number of games out there that need scoring, I think it's only natural that you start to see a crossover of musical styles. Every big game wants full orchestration and big, sweeping, film-like soundscapes, but it ends up feeling like everything else and kind of blends into the background. What you want to be looking out for is unique styles and ways of writing music. I mean, it won't always work, but you can appreciate the effort. Everyone remembers the music used in Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple, right? It's iconic at this point for its ability to unsettle the player with this eerie collection of instruments and sound effects that help give the Forest Temple a vibe that is hard to pinpoint as you explore your first Zelda dungeon as a fully grown adult. If you were to trade out this theme for any other Forest Dungeon themed track in the series, it just wouldn't quite be the same. This kind of creative instrumentation is crucially important for separating one theme from every other theme in the game, and likewise, some games try very hard to do this with the entire soundtrack so as to not be lumped in with every other game out there. Most of the Yoshi games do this without hurting my brain. Most of them. I heard about the soundtrack to Yoshi's New Island very shortly after the game came out, which, considering that we tend to take most soundtracks for granted these days, is not a great sign. If you can cast your mind back to Yoshi's Island and some of the incredible music in that game, composed by some guy called Koji Kondo, who I think worked on a few other games I don't know, the shift to something as awkward as the soundtrack to Yoshi's New Island almost makes sense since Kondo didn't work on it. I think the main problem is a bit of tonal confusion, where this game is going for the same innocently adorable oral aesthetic that other Yoshi games went for, see most of Yoshi's Story for examples, but achieved it by littering half the soundtrack with out-of-tune kazoos, and I guess Yoshi's trying their hand at singing some of this music. It's definitely creative, I'll give them that, but it also grates really quickly, and when the loops are as short as they are, you can slowly feel the madness seep in and take over. The themes for each world are handled in a really creative way, with instruments being added to a basic theme with each successive world, but the loop is of an annoying 10-second motif, and I'm reaching for the knife! I have no control right now! But hey, it's different and unique, that has to count for something, right? Yeah, not much. My ears can only take so much. So I guess at this stage we're getting to soundtracks that barely resemble music. I studied music extensively at school and we had to listen to some wacky shit that was masquerading as music, so I like to think that I've built up a pretty strong tolerance for unconventional attempts of making music. That being said, it's recently been brought to my attention that a special edition of the first Resident Evil game came out in 1998 with DualShock support and a brand new fully orchestrated soundtrack. I've always found it a bit weird when an updated version of a game also retweaks the soundtrack, because I often fear that the essence of the original music would probably be lost along the way. Often this isn't the case, but it's good to know that this fear isn't completely irrational. Horror games like Resident Evil have uniquely delicate soundtracks, where you don't always need a big scary menacing theme pounding you in the back of the head reminding you there's a big scary guy behind you, because you do need quieter, more reflective moments that create contrast and tension and a creepy atmosphere. So you need your soundtrack to be as equally atmospheric as your game, and hopefully not fucking awful. So the original idea was to remake Resident Evil's soundtrack but with better orchestration, because apparently the original was lacking in some way that isn't obvious to anyone. This task was given to Mamoru Samuragochi, who is a deaf Japanese composer who admitted in 2014 that most of the work he's been given credit for over the years wasn't actually written by him. That's pretty shitty, but either way, the soundtrack to Resident Evil 1 was completely overhauled in 1998 and replaced with an entire track listing full of crap. Okay, maybe it isn't all that terrible. I kind of like what they did with the save room music, but it's all very different, and most of the time, like with the mansion theme, this is a very bad thing. At a stretch, I can understand where this comes from, because Resident Evil was always a game that walked the very, very thin line between terrifying and ridiculously stupid, and the campy delivery of dialogue certainly falls in line with the latter, so maybe this new soundtrack is trying to ram home the idea that Resi 1 is a goofy video game, but this is all a bit much, isn't it? If this was intentional, it feels too much like the characters are winking at the audience, like Resi 1 is now aware that it's a bit silly, and that's not what I like to see. How many different layers of irony have we got here? I can't knock these games too hard. Composing music is a very hard job, especially when it's for something like a game or a movie where the music has to match what's happening on screen at any one point. It can be very difficult to write music that accurately reflects that. To that end, I'd say that most games make a good fist of it, and even if the soundtrack is unremarkable, it usually isn't bad. As long as it doesn't physically hurt to listen to, I think everything's gonna be just fine. Then again, there have been a lot of video games, and some of them have been made by sadists. Anything could happen, which I think is part of, if not the whole mantra behind the 2004 Venezuelan Sega Genesis classic known as Crazy Bus. You can buy this game right now on Etsy for too much money, at which point you'll notice what is very much an unlicensed Sega Genesis game about buses and how crazy they are. Also, it's some rudimentary game where you move a bus across a screen and earn points for doing something. I'm not so sure, but a lot of this is in Spanish, and even if I did understand, I don't think that would help all that much. In truth, that's not the reason why you'd ever play Crazy Bus, and you don't even need to play anything to understand what this game is all about. The soundtrack to Crazy Bus is one of the most remarkable things I've ever heard. There are two songs, one for the title screen and one for the screen where you select a bus, and as far as I can tell, there isn't much of a difference between the two. It's just this smear of garbled notes with no discernible pattern or melody, where you can easily skip a minute ahead on either song and not notice any change whatsoever. It's so random that I can't help but feel like it might have hidden meaning or have some kind of subconscious effect on the human brain. Feel free to subscribe, hit that bell. I feel like I've been reprogrammed and that I need to assassinate someone right now. This hasn't happened before. This is RabbidLuigi, and the one cool thing about the Crazy Bus soundtrack is that it is actually random. If you were to load this game up a couple of times and listen closely, you can tell that it isn't quite the same pattern every time. And this is a cool idea and concept, but there's a reason why traditional music uses recognizable patterns. Our brain like to see and hear patterns. But this just makes my brain cry. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.